You're heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Hey everybody, Brian McClanahan here. We're back for the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Good to be with you. Good to be back. We had a really, really good week at the Abbeville Institute. Our articles were widely shared, had a lot of views. We had a great time putting them up there, and really great information. So we have a lot to talk about this week. Before we get to that, though, remember, I'm going to give you another reminder, February 26th, 27th, Charleston, South Carolina. You got to be there at our conference on the PC attack on the South, 2-day conference. Well, actually, it's a Friday night and a Saturday. Friday night, we've got some short little talks on the meaning of the PC attack. We're going to have 5 little presentations, about 10 minutes each. And then on Saturday, we have our full conference with a lunch and a banquet. So come on out to that. The banquet speaker is Bertram Hayes Davis, the great-great-grandson of Jefferson Davis. His topic is Jefferson Davis, Renaissance Man. You're not going to hear that very often in modern polite conversation in society, unfortunately, even though that used to be considered to be the case in America. And that's actually something we're going to get at this week with the material we had at the website. We'll also have some other great talks, Clyde Wilson, Don Livingston, Barbara Marthel, Kerry Roberts, myself. So it will be Tom Fleming. Be a very good time. We want to see you out there. Come on out. The information is available on our website, www.abbevilleinstitute.org, and you can see that under upcoming events. You can also find us on Facebook and on Twitter and YouTube. We've got all of our lectures from the past conference up on YouTube, so we'd love to see you go out there and look at those. Just search for Abbeville Institute on YouTube. And please remember that we exist on your generous contributions. So if you would like to give us a donation for less than $5 a month, you can become a member and support what we are doing here, exploring what's true and valuable in the Southern tradition, pushing back against the hysteria that's now gripping the United States about all things Southern. And it's not going to stop with just the 4-year period of the war. It's going to eventually encompass everything that's Southern, and eventually everything that has to do with Western civilization. I mean, that really is. The South is just the beginning of all this. It's the easiest, it's the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, in the process by which people are trying to recreate the United States, a process that is ongoing. It's interesting. Here we are on the Sesquicentennial of Reconstruction. That process of recreating the United States began in 1862, really, when you started the issue of Reconstruction in the North, and how that dramatically affected everything in society, not just the social order, which everyone usually focuses on, and of course the ends justify the means there, and that's the general opinion, but also the political and economic order of the United States. Without the South to serve as a real formidable opposition to political and economic Reconstruction as well, which they had always done, this creates a new union. So this PC attack on the South, I mean, this is just, if you look at it in the longue durée, as Browdell would say, we have a process that's been going on for over 100 years, 150 years now. We're still being recreated. I've often said when the stock market became more important than the cotton market in Columbus, Georgia, you knew you had been reconstructed because Columbus, Georgia was for so long a cotton hub, and now we've got insurance and banking in Columbus, Georgia. Those are the major industries. So things have changed a lot in the South. We've already talked a little about the New South. That New South period is so interesting, and I wish that we will get into, we'll have more articles about that as we move forward. One of these days we'll have a conference on it. We'll talk about the New South and what that really meant, and how people thought about the New South, and how they thought about the New South in relation to the Old South, what those things mean, what we can get out of that. Remember, when we're talking about the Southern tradition, and I think that, and this is going to be part of the topic of my little talk on Friday night, we have to learn how to sell the Southern tradition. It's not that we want to live, or I should say, go back to the 19th century. And there are things that we can say, well, we don't want to recreate that in America today. But the South can teach us how to live. The Old South can teach us how to live. There are examples that we can find in that and say, Well, maybe they did some of these things better than what we're doing now. Maybe their critique of American society at that time was more prescient than what we give them credit for. Because what you do when you demonize people and minimize them based on what we consider today to be moral failings, you don't listen to anything else they had to say. And that creates a very dangerous situation, because we don't do this with any other people. We don't do this with the Greeks. We don't do this with the Romans. We don't do this with anyone in medieval Europe. But yet we do it with Southerners because they're in our own backyard. And so it's easy to pick them off and say, well, I mean, we don't agree with that in American society today, so we're just not going to listen to these people. We do that at our own peril. And so this week actually gets into that a little bit. As we know, this week we had two very important birthdays in the Southern tradition, and Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. At one time, two men who were considered to be American heroes, not just Southern heroes, but American heroes. And I go back, when I wrote my politically incorrect guide to real American heroes, and I had a chapter on Lee and Jackson, one of the things I talked about in that book is my father for years had a calendar hanging on the wall from the year of his birth. And on that calendar, which was produced by Northern Insurance Company, they had Jackson and Lee's birthdays on the calendar. And this was in the middle of the 20th century, 1940 in fact. And so in 1940, it was still considered acceptable to say that Robert E. Lee was an American hero, and Stonewall Jackson, Thomas Jackson, was an American hero. You can't do that today. These men are being, we have the Lee statue being taken down in New Orleans. You've got all Confederate symbols under attack. And this is a relatively recent phenomenon. For most of the last 150 years, people considered Confederate heroes to be American heroes. They could debate whether their cause was just or whether the act of secession was legal. And we can talk about those things. Of course, we're going to get into that idea of treason here a little bit in one of the essays. But no one ever doubted that Lee was one of the greatest Americans in history. He came from a superb lineage. His father, Light Horse Harry Lee, being Washington's most trusted cavalry officer. He's from a very old family that had been part of Virginia history from the beginning, essentially, of the founding of Virginia. They had been part of all the major political questions of the day, whether it was the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. They had all been part of this stuff. The family itself, the Lee family. And so here you have a man that was part of that tradition and understood that tradition and decided to side with his state rather than the United States when war came. And we'll get into this idea of how was Lee really a warmonger, or what was his view of war, and we'll talk about that very briefly in the last piece of the week. But we started the week with a piece by Herbert Chambers entitled American Hypocrisy. And this gets into the notion that we have this very strange situation in America today. We have a situation where people are very upset about radical Islam, and that you have people who are determined in that particular religion to kill people, and that these people are being, some of them we know are being brought into the United States by the thousands, and some of those people do not like the United States. We've seen instance after instance on American soil where Americans have been killed by people who hate the United States, but at the same time, you can't say these things in polite society anymore. You have to say, well, we're going to give these people a fair shake. We're going to say, well, it's not all Muslims. It's not Islam itself. We're going to allow them time to explain their religion, to explain who they are, to explain that it's a religion of peace, or whatever they say, to explain that this is just a few people in society doing these things, that most Muslims are peaceful people. And that may be true, but they're given plenty of time to explain these things. However, you have one instance, a terrible instance, in Charleston, South Carolina, somebody misusing a Southern symbol, wasn't even on him at the time of his terrible, heartless, heinous attack. And from that point forward, the hysteria begins that we have to go out and tear down everything that's associated with the South of the war, 1861 to 65. And not just that, we're going to start tearing down, looking at destroying other symbols of the South. I mean, you had Calhoun's statue in Charleston, South Carolina, spray painted. People are going out and destroying these things. And so Southerners, as Chambers says, are not given the same kind of fair shake. And he says, American citizens who simply appeal for the truth of Confederate history and advocate intolerance for no one are treated like a revolting, backwards pariah. Muslim symbols are to be accepted, while Confederate symbols representing courage, independence, and self-determination, the very foundations of our country, are to be trashed and annihilated. And he says, amazing, isn't it, the hypocrisy of it all? But it is so evident why grave adherence to this fallacious double standard is as sure as gravity. To provide the same consideration for Confederate history would open the gates to understanding just what the war was really all about, and that, as a consequence, would lead to the discovery that something criminally unconstitutional did indeed happen to the South and the American Republic. So, he says, we know all this can never be allowed to happen, that the South can never be given a fair shake, because if you do, it will open the door to the true reason the South was fighting for independence. And it's independence, it's self-determination. As they said countless times after the war. As they said when they decided not to agree to the 13th Amendment, which would have preserved slavery perpetually in the states, even though that amendment was passed and it was on the table, the South didn't come back into the Union. They wanted independence, and they're willing to fight and die for it. Self-determination. And he says, and to top it all off, it would be laughable if it weren't so pathetic that many Americans are horrified at and abhor the Islamic call for the extermination of our Western culture, but at the same time support the genocide of the Southern American landscape. This is something we got into our last conversation in Stone Mountain. This is true, right? I mean, one case you say you can't destroy an entire religion. You can't paint an entire people with broad strokes. They're not. I mean, there are good people in this, and of course we're shocked at what's happening here with what radical Islam is doing to people, Christians all over the world. They're destroying historical monuments all over the world. They're doing terrible things, and we're shocked at all of this stuff, and yet we're willing to do it right here in the United States. Tear down statues, tear down symbols. Who knows where we're going to put them, but we're going to do that, and we're fine with that here in the United States, but yet we're not fine with it in other parts of the world. It's amazing how we have this hypocritical double standard here in the United States. And this piece was widely read. And he finishes the piece with a quote by General Patrick Cleburne. And he says, Cleburne said, quote, "Surrender means that the history of this heroic struggle will be written by the enemy, that our youth will be trained by Northern school teachers, will learn from Northern school books their version of the war, will be impressed by all the influence of history and education to regard our gallant dead as traitors and our maimed veterans as fit subjects for derision." This is exactly what's happened. Cleburne could see it coming. Other Southerners could see it coming in the New South period. This is why I say the New South period is very important. When all these monuments were being built, when history was being written, they could see it coming, and they wanted to try to affect that and not make it so bad. But here we are, 2015, 2016. We see what's happening, and some of this stuff has slowed down a little bit, but it's still out there. And unfortunately, you have a few idiots and yahoos who are going to make things even worse at times. But the idea is that we have this double standard here in America, and you can't say you admire Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson anymore because that is considered to be politically incorrect. Yet, at the same time, when you have people who, there is a large faction of which want to hurt Americans and the United States, you can't say that either, because that, again, is also politically incorrect. We're running into a very odd, I don't think, the only time in history where you could find this in Western civilization would be, I think, during the French Revolution, where you had you couldn't say certain things. So communists are very successful at this kind of stuff. Now, this is George Orwell's 1984. That's what we're getting at here. You have doublespeak and newspeak. You can't say certain things. History has to be changed to fit the current narrative. This is what the communists do, and essentially, these are what these people are. I remember years ago, I was having a conversation with someone, and I called them a communist, I think, in the conversation, and there was no shame in that anymore. If this was the 1980s or the 70s or the 60s, you had open communists back then, but for a time, it was a bad word to be called a communist. You didn't want to be called that. Now you have a man who's an open communist running for president on one of the two parties, and nobody cares anymore. This has become hip and cool again to be a communist, and of course all that entails, which would be suppression of liberty, suppression of free speech, suppression of the other side, and that's what these people want. They don't want open and honest discourse. They don't want debate. They want suppression. So they don't want the other side to be heard, and that therein lies the problem in all of this. Okay, so Herbert Chambers, great article on American hypocrisy on Monday, had a lot of views. And then on Tuesday we had another great post by Mike Scruggs, Robert E. Lee, gallant soldier, noble patriot, true Christian. Of course, Lee's birthday, January 19th, so we had to have a week dedicated to Lee, and then Jackson on the 21st. We had 3 articles about Lee this week, 1 about Jackson. And you have to talk about these people because of how important they are to the fabric of not only the South, but America, what they represented in the South. What Lee represented in the South was not, if you took Lee as an example, outside, let's say the war never happened, Lee would still have been representative of what the South was. And same thing with Jackson. They represented what was best about the South, and for a time they were considered to be what was best about America, not just the South. And that's the important thing we have to, again, if we're selling the South, if we're doing Southern apologetics, what was best about these people? How can they teach us to live? How can they teach us to live? And Scruggs says a couple of really important things. This piece is actually very short. He puts in some quotations from several individuals, from Lee himself and then other individuals describing Lee, about who he was as a man and what he thought about things. And Scruggs says, there is no question, however, that the celebration of Lee's birthday has suffered because of changing political agendas. Although these political agendas are based on questionable political expediency, false historical narratives, and increasing ignorance of history. And this is 100% true. It used to be everyone celebrated Lee's birthday because they understood who Lee was. They understood what he represented in the South, which you had this horrible book that I actually reviewed for the website in a video review last year on Lee's birthday, Reading the Man, and by Pryor. And she goes out and she collected some letters that had never been published before, the Lee family gave her access to, and she basically says that Lee, everyone misunderstands Lee, that he really was an ardent slave monger, that he didn't really oppose slavery, et cetera, et cetera. She's really trying to tear him down. The book has got all kinds of problems, and if you want to see that video, you can find it on our website, and it's entitled "Misreading the Man," Robert E. Lee. And so I got into that last year, so I'm not going to spend time on that, but that is the problem here. We have this changing narrative of Robert E. Lee that is based on a political agenda. And Scruggs also says, America's crisis does not demand more vote-buying schemes and ignorant demagoguery. It does not demand sacrificing our freedom, our culture, and true history to coercive government, anti-Christian multiculturalism, and cowardly political correctness. What we need are leaders with courage, character, common sense, and wisdom. This is why we need to remember Robert E. Lee and many others like him as examples to ourselves and our posterity. So Lee is an example. As I said, the Old South can teach us how to live. And Lee is a member of that Old South from a very prominent American family. His wife, directly related to George Washington through marriage. Arlington House was like an extension of Washington's family itself. The priceless artifacts they had at Arlington House, which were seized by the Union Army. We had an article about that by Karen Stokes not long ago, a couple of weeks ago. And the damage and destruction done to Arlington House by the Union Army. Everyone understood who Lee was. And they understood who Lee was before he decided to side with Virginia and not the general government. He was offered command of the Union Army and rejected it because he would not fight his people in Virginia. That used to be considered to be a noble act, not a treasonous act, as it would be said now. So he gives you a number of great quotes, and the title of the article comes from Jefferson Davis when he said that he called Lee, "This good citizen, this gallant soldier, this great general, this true patriot, had yet a higher praise than this or these. He was a true Christian." Now, how many times are you going to hear that said about somebody today? You're just not going to hear it. It won't happen. So he was a true Christian, a patriot, a soldier, citizen. And then he gives you other words of praise and things that Lee had said. Writing to one of his sons, he advised, "Duty is the sublimest word in our language. Do your duty in all things. You cannot do more. You should never wish to do less." And we also have to remember about Lee, a lot of the things that the information he received from his father. He didn't know his father very well. His father was broke and in exile and suffering from all kinds of physical ailments. But his father had written a number of letters teaching him how to live. And so Lee was trying to do the same thing. And we can learn from those words of wisdom, not only from Lee, but also from Lee's father. And there's an article on the website, The Art of Southern Manliness, and where it talks about some of these things. So you can look that up too, The Art of Southern Manliness. So then on Wednesday, we republished a piece. We had run it when the website was first launched again, back in 2014. It was one of the first articles that went up in the Clyde Wilson Library. So we put it back up again because it probably didn't receive enough attention at that time. Our website was not being visited as much as it is today, so decided to rerun it. It's by Clyde Wilson, Robert E. Lee, and the American Union. And what Dr. Wilson does here is get into the idea of Lee from a political standpoint. And he is often called a traitor, and Dr. Wilson gets into this idea of what is treason. And so he begins almost at the beginning. Let's dispose of the charge of treason. It is amazing that there are still, at this date, a century and a half later, and long after Lee was accepted as a premier American hero, people who throw out this accusation. And he says, through the mystery of the internet, I have been hearing from such people fairly often. Those who declare Lee an irredeemable traitor nearly always use violent, hateful language against Lee or myself or both. Such people's ignorance of the founding principles of the United States is truly pitiable. Their worship of the government, right or wrong, is scary and suggestive of fascism. President Eisenhower once wrote an eloquent letter explaining to an unreconstructed Yankee his mistaken view of American history and calling Lee a traitor. And then he goes on, to call Lee a traitor is a dishonest attempt to preempt the very question that was at issue, the nature of the Union. Was George Washington, who had held a royal commission, a traitor for fighting the invaders and would-be conquerors of his country? Was he obligated to fight for the king against the American states? Did not England's finest statesmen sympathize with the American position? As Douglas Freeman definitively laid it out, the situations of Washington and Lee were alike, as were the choices they made. Attendance at West Point and a commission in the Army is in no way bound anyone to make aggressive war against other Americans. After all, Southern taxes have been paid more than their fair share of support of West Point and the Army. Americans properly swear to uphold the Constitution, not the government. Since the consent of the people is the most basic principle of American government, how could the people of Virginia commit treason against themselves? And how could any act in their defense be treason? Incidentally, New England spokesmen have been since 1828 accusing Southerners of treason for opposing the protective tariff policy. It was part of their campaign to use the government to feather their own nests and to distract attention from their own real treason during the War of 1812. And he says, Again, Lee was the product of a pre-ideological society where the treason shouters are products of post-French Revolution nationalism. Lincoln and his accomplices were modern statists. The Union meant to them the machinery of the federal government under the control of their party to be used for their agenda. But as the Southern poet Allen Tate put it, the original Union was a gentleman's agreement, not a group of buildings in Washington from which sacred commandments were issued. And so then he gets into, just by saying that, the government, the Union was not the government. And we think that today. We when people pledge allegiance to a flag, unquestionably accepting this, the Union is not the government. The government is not the Union. Washington, D.C. is not the Union. It's a union of states. Again, a gentleman's agreement. And one side broke the agreement, and so the other side decided to get out for a variety of reasons. And history is not black and white, shades of gray. And Lee, of course, he gets into the fact that Lee was an educated man, that he understood history, he understood the nature of people. He understood the decision he had to make. And he understood that his decision had to be determined by history. He also gets into the fact that some of the people that are often considered revered on the other side, and when you get into the story of Lee refusing the commission to command the Union Army, and he says, who is Francis Preston Blair Sr., who wrote the note trying to get Lee to accept the commission. He was a notorious political fixer and insider. He had played that role for Andrew Jackson and now opportunistically switched to the Republicans. So the offer to command the Army came not from the President or the Secretary of War or the Commanding General. It came from someone who had held no official position except as beneficiary of lucrative government contracts. This itself shows how little Lincoln and his cohorts understood the South, or a man like Lee, or the deadly crisis they were attempting to manage. Why did they do this? For Lincoln and Secretary Cameron, whose main qualification for office was his chieftainship of a Pennsylvania political machine, it was standard operating procedure to gain their ends by the use of patronage, that is, bribery. They could not believe anyone who would turn down such an offer. They needed Lee, since most of the most highly respected officers of the Army had already resigned, and his resignation would be another blow to their prestige. Making the offer indirectly and unofficially was also their standard operating procedure. If Lee turned them down, or if they later changed their minds about the offer, they had, in good Nixonian fashion, what they considered complete deniability. And in fact, after Lee turned them down, they did lie. Cameron continued long to claim that such an offer had never been made to Lee, although he finally admitted it to an interviewer in the 1880s, shortly before his death. Here's a new bit of information, Clyde goes on to say, that was not seen by Douglas Freeman. Lee's kinsman, Lewis A. Washington, wrote a note in the margins of page 386-87 of Volume 2 of his copy of Alexander Stephens's constitutional view of the late war between the states. It reads, quote, General Lee told me himself that Mr. Lincoln, through Mr. Blair, had made him offers of the most flattering character if he would not resign, and he, Lee, looked upon Blair as the devil incarnate, if such was ever in human form. So here we have two different kinds of characters. Lee as this noble man, this noble patriot, this noble citizen, and Blair as the devil incarnate. Two different types of people. Which one are you going to like? Which one is more representative of America? Lee, the hero, or Blair, the schemer? And I think that nowadays we like the schemers. They tend to be kind of hip and fascinating, interesting. Lee, the noble patriot, the true Christian, the gallant soldier, is now the pariah. Why is this? We never consider this. Why do we do that? Why is it we like people that have questionable character, and Lee, a man of good character, a good family, is now a pariah? We've flipped America upside down. All because of an issue that can be used for political motivation. to attack a particular section and a particular part of American history and a particular people, when ultimately the North was just as much part of that entire issue, which of course I'm speaking about slavery, than the South. They were complicit in it. Clyde goes on to say, as Lee said after the war, I fought against the people of the North because I believed they were seeking to wrest from the people of the South their dearest rights. And another time after the war he said, quote, I did only what my duty demanded. I could have taken no other course without dishonor. And if it were all to be done over again, I should act in precisely the same manner. This is a very good piece, and Clyde wraps up with an excellent quote. If America today does not wish to share in the glory and honor of Lee and his men, that is a judgment on America and not on them, which is 100% true. On Thursday, we had an article on Stonewall Jackson. It's the preface to James Robertson's excellent biography of Stonewall Jackson, entitled Stonewall Jackson, the Man, the Soldier, the Legend. It's excerpted. We didn't publish the entire preface, and we didn't put the entire preface on the website. The preface is available for free. If you go to Amazon and you click on Look Inside, there's the preface. So took pieces of that and put it on the website that described Jackson. Of course, Jackson, for a long period of time, again, was considered to be an American hero. And Robertson himself says that near the conclusion. He says, today he is an American hero. More than ever, Jackson embodies the famous observation made at his death by one of his former cadets. He is not Virginia's alone. God gave him to the world. Now, this was written in 1997. I don't think today you can say he is an American hero. He's an American pariah, just like Lee. This was written 20 years ago. In 20 years, so much has changed. When this biography came out, you could say, without doubt, Jackson was still an American hero. But that image of Jackson is fast fading in American society. And he gets into some of the great things about Jackson. One of them, of course, is his extreme devotion to Christianity and how that dictated his life. Robertson says he was 34, Jackson, when he bought his first and only home. For a year and a half, he knew its sanctuary and its pleasures. Then came Civil War. Love of his birthright, Virginia, was one reason Jackson sided with the Southern cause. Defense of hearth and home was another. A third was more philosophical. Like many men in the South of the South in 1860, Jackson was convinced that Northerners had violated principles of both the Founding Fathers and Christianity by attempting to create a new society that lacked order as well as cohesiveness. The North seemed to be striving to alter basic American structures. Such activity flew in the face of God's preordained notion of what America should be. If the South did not resist, it would stand in failure of God's will and possibly become subservient to Northern domination. Well, it did. Thus, in the words of a recent writer, much of the Confederate ideology to which Jackson subscribed transformed God himself into a nationalist and made war for political independence into a crusade. At the order of Virginia authorities, Jackson led the VMI cadets into service. When he departed Lexington that Sunday afternoon in April 1861, the major had no way of knowing that he would never see his adopted hometown again. Jackson always believed, Robertson said, in aggressive action, prompt, fierce, and decisive. Strike the foe before he can deliver a blow. If repulsed, fall back and be ready instantly to strike again if the opportunity arises. Seek ever to change a defeat into victory. If successful in the attack, pursue the enemy relentlessly and by decisive assaults destroy the force in front. This will end the war. Jackson was aggressive. You can look at what he was doing. You can apply it to all kinds of issues in life, not just warfare. Strike the foe before he can deliver a blow. If repulsed, fall back and be ready instantly to strike again if the opportunity arises. Seek ever to change a defeat into victory. This is what we're trying to do at the Institute. Such strategy worked brilliantly for Jackson. A widely circulated story throughout the Confederacy was of the devil sending Jackson a petition to stop sending him so many Yankees because he was running out of room. Years after the war, a Manassas resident who as a lad saw Jackson several times summed up this general succinctly. Wasn't much to look at, but you ought to have seen how his men would look at him, just like he was God himself. Soldiers idolized him. A brigadier general whom Jackson did not particularly like explained in part why. Quote, "It was their common baptism of fire in the battles, and his absolute fearlessness, if not unconsciousness, of danger, which endeared him to his men, and gave rise to the saying, when a shout was heard on the march or in camp, 'Shaw! It's only Jackson or Rabbit.'" Robertson says something that would be, you can't say this today. The Civil War was a contest in which both sides fought gallantly for the absolutes of freedom and independence. Well, you can't say that now. This is what Robertson said back in 1997. Yet Jackson constantly had a higher goal in mind. This servant of the Lord prayed intensely, led his forces with the hope that they might become an army of the living God, and even found time in an hour of victory to send an overdue contribution to his home church. Such attitudes may have struck a few observers as unusual, but they were part of the magnetism that made good men want to serve under him. This is why Jackson's a hero. And one eulogy from George Christian, Judge George L. Christian, this is what he said about Jackson. It's a poem. "A hero came among us as we slept. At first he lowly knelt, then rose and wept. Then gathering up 1,000 spears, he swept across the field of Mars, then bowed farewell and walked among the stars in the land where we were dreaming." Another VMI student waited until 1886 to express his admiration. With the perspective of 30 years' reflection, Captain Thomas M. Boyd wrote of his commander, "His fame is as lasting as the solid stones of his native hills, and yet there is for him a purer, nobler record, his quiet Christian walk in life, his right words, his faithful, manly bearing, his victory over self, his known devotion to the word of truth. He was indeed a soldier of the cross." This is why Jackson is one of the more politically incorrect figures in American history today. Not only was he fighting for the South and for independence, as Robertson said, not a hint of slavery, but he was a soldier of the cross, something that you cannot be in today's society. We wrapped up our week of Lee and Jackson with a piece from the great Richard Weaver, Lee the Philosopher. This was published in 1948, and it's a different look at Lee, and he gets into Lee's philosophical positions, one of them being, was Lee a warmonger? And he starts with this well-known phrase that Lee said as he was at Fredericksburg, and he's looking across the battlefield, and he's seeing piles of Union soldiers from the assault on their position. And the horror of the battlefield, and men cowering behind these bodies in freezing temperatures to try not to get shot. And Lee says, "It is well, this is terrible, otherwise we should grow fond of it." And he says, what is that meaning? What Weaver says is, here is a poignant confession of mankind's historic ambivalence toward the institution of war, its moral revulsion against the immense destructiveness, accompanied by a fascination with the greatest of all games. Or, he says, if we shift to the single individual, part of him wants peace and another part wants war. And it is upon the resolution of this inner struggle that our prospect of general peace depends, as MacArthur so wisely observed upon the decks of the Missouri. The cliches of modern thought have virtually obscured this commonplace of human psychology, and world peace programs take into account everything but this tragic flaw and the natural man, the temptation to appeal to physical superiority. There is no political structure which knaves cannot defeat, and subtle analysis of the psyche may prove of more avail than schemes for world parliament. In contrast with the empty formulations of propagandists, Lee's saying suggests the concrete wisdom of a parable. Most important of all, Lee seems to have felt that it is possible for civilization to war, or to go on existing in the presence of war, if self-control is not entirely lost. So he gets in this idea of civilized warfare. And what Lee thought about that. We can debate whether this actually exists. But Weaver says, as one studies Lee opinions of the events of the angry 60s, it becomes evident that he understood the tendency of the mass mentality of war as only the most expert manipulators of modern propaganda have come to understand it, though his knowledge prompted a different kind of action. He knew that the mind of a people at war is psychopathic, that it is subject to hysteria and hallucination, that often it cannot tell right from wrong or even friend from foe, that it is likely to prefer revenge to survival. Recurring time and time again in his correspondence of the years 65 to 70 is the counsel of patience and silence. The two sides had not waited for the cessation of firing to inaugurate the polemic struggle. Generals published their vindications. Politicians hastened into print to prove that their courses have been constitutional. Publicists of every kind discussed the northern and southern ways of life. Amid this din, Lee, although constantly importuned, said nothing. He expressed a desire to write a history of the campaigns in Virginia, but the writing was never done. Lee once remarked, "I do not like to think about those years." Apparently, Lee realized that the sole hope of reconciliation lay in a returning sense of justice, and that this restoration would only be impeded by protest and controversy. He wrote in 1866, "At present, the public mind is not prepared to receive the truth." Weaver says, like the observation dropped at Fredericksburg, it becomes more troubling the longer one reflects on it. Weaver says, I would not represent Lee as a prophet, but as a man who stood close enough to the eternal varieties to utter prophecies sometimes when he spoke. He was brought up in the old school, which places responsibility upon the individual and not upon some abstract social agency. Sentimental humanitarianism manifestly does not speak to language of duty but of indulgence. The notion that obligations are tyrannies and that wants, not deserts, should be the measure, not deserts I should say, should be the measure of what one has by now shown its destructive power. We have tended to ignore the inexorable truth that rights must be earned. Fully interpreted, Lee's duty is the means whereby freedom preserves itself by acknowledging responsibility. Man then perfects himself by discipline, and at the heart of discipline lies self-denial. The young mother brought an infant to Lee to bless and was told, "Teach him he must deny himself." She was receiving perhaps the deepest insight of his life. And this is where Weaver says Lee is at his best. Lee the philosopher. He concludes, if Lee had been a member of that archetype republic, which a great philosopher imagined, with its orders of value and wisdom, is it not likely that he would have been promoted a grade? I think he would have risen from warrior to philosopher king. Lee would have gone from warrior to philosopher king, like Marcus Aurelius, if they had only won. So remember these things as we move forward. Remember, as you're selling the South and the history of the South, why men like Lee and Jackson are so important. And turn the argument on its head. Explain why these men are representative of what's real and valuable in America, in the American tradition. Don't allow the other side to take the field and to determine the discourse and the contest, Turn it on its head. Say, well, this is why Lee was great. This is why Jackson was great. And allow them to explain to you why those traits are not good traits. Because if you can do that, if you can say, well, tell me what about this about Lee is so wrong? What about this about Jackson is so wrong? Put them on the defensive because they won't have a response. I think that's one thing we have to keep hammering home. They won't have a response. It's our obligation, our duty, as Lee would say, to do this. And if we can do these things, we can strike like Jackson. When we have opportunities, we can parry and maybe turn the tide of battle. It's a long battle. I'm not certain it's going to happen right away, but we can try. And that's what we can get out of the week of Lee and Jackson's birthday. They were willing to try. Even when the odds seemed against them, they were willing to try. And we need to recognize that because the assault, as Chambers wrote early on Monday, the assault is coming. It's already here. And we have to figure out how to parry the assault, how to counter the assault, and how to sell the Old South or the Southern tradition in a way that there is no response besides exposing yourself as a firm opponent of the American tradition and of Western civilization. If we can do that, then I think we can gain traction in our defense. If not, it's going to be a very long uphill struggle. And so this is why putting up pieces about Lee and Jackson is so important and why you should share these things far and wide. And all these pieces this week were actually shared quite a lot online. So take a look at them, read them. I mentioned a couple other pieces in the talk today. Go out there and look at the Abbeville Institute website, find those things, and read them. Again, please help us explore what's true and valuable in the Southern tradition. Come to our conferences. Send a donation if you can't come. We have other conferences coming up this year. We have a summer school coming up this year. A lot of things going on. We want to see you there. We want to meet you. We want you to be part of this. All it takes is a little time and a little bit of energy and not even a whole lot of money. If you just want to send less than $5 a month, you can be a member. And that would help us keep the lights on, help keep this podcast going, help keep the website up, help us do our programs, help us reach as many people as we can. Okay, until next time, good day.